One frozen night, a valley filled with soldiers went silent, washed away by a strike no one believed Ukraine would dare attempt. In this video, we will look at the extraordinary events inside Russia's Veluki Valley, where strategic miscalculation met Ukrainian innovation at the worst possible moment. We'll reveal why Russia chose the valley, how Ukraine discovered the troop concentration, and how a perfectly planned dam breach prevented what could have become a catastrophic collapse of the Kupiansk defense. You'll understand the simulations, the risks, the international consequences, and the reason this moment became a turning point in the war. This incident wasn't just destruction. It was strategy, geopolitics, and timing converging in one unforgettable moment. Most people following the Russia-Ukraine war have seen dramatic battles, drone footage, missile strikes, and intense city fighting spread across social media and news broadcasts. But one of the most shocking events of the conflict did not unfold on a frontline village or a contested trench network. It happened far away from any place where Ukraine was expected to operate. It occurred deep inside Russia itself, in a region Moscow believed was immune to direct attack and protected by geography, distance, and confidence. And yet, on a freezing night when a landscape was so cold it could silence even the loudest sounds, an entire Russian regiment disappeared in seconds. They were not destroyed by missiles or artillery. Instead, their downfall came from a force far older and far more powerful than any weapon invented by humans: water. What unfolded inside the Veluki Valley would later be studied by officers around the world, not because of its brutality, but because it demonstrated how quickly the balance of power in a war can shift when one side combines ingenuity with desperation. Before we dive into the heart of this story, make sure you subscribe to Prime World Connect, because here we break down global events with context, clarity, and accuracy. In a world crowded with noise, this channel brings you calm, analytical, fact-driven storytelling that helps you see the geopolitical landscape as it truly is. To understand how this moment in the Veluki Valley came to shape a critical phase of the war, we need to rewind to the final months of 2025. By then, the conflict had entered a dangerous and unpredictable stage. Many military analysts described this period as a pressure cooker slowly building toward rupture. Both Ukraine and Russia were exhausted, yet neither side could afford to take its foot off the gas. Every town, every bridge, and every supply line had become a crucial piece of a much larger puzzle. In eastern Ukraine, the fighting around the Kupiansk axis had intensified beyond anything seen earlier that year. On the surface, Kupiansk looked like just another city caught in the crossfire. But beneath that surface was a strategic truth both armies understood clearly. The city acted as a major logistical artery for Ukraine's defense network. Through this region flowed ammunition, reinforcements, fuel, medical supplies, and all of the vital equipment that kept the front line running. If Russia managed to capture Kupiansk or even choke off the supply routes feeding into it, large sections of the Ukrainian defense line would become vulnerable. An entire portion of the front, stretching for dozens of kilometers, could suddenly collapse. Russia knew this. So did Ukraine. It made Kupiansk one of the most consequential battlegrounds of late 2025. But at the same time, political turbulence thousands of kilometers away introduced a new problem. In Washington, delays and disagreements slowed the approval of crucial aid packages. The ripple effect was immediate. Ukraine's supply of artillery shells began to drop. By November, the shortage had reached alarming levels. Ukrainian commanders were forced to ration ammunition more aggressively than at any point since the earliest days of the invasion. Gun crews counted every shell. Units sometimes held fire not because they lacked targets, but because they lacked the rounds needed to hit them. Analysts warned that even a temporary shortage of artillery could lead to disastrous consequences on the ground, giving Russian forces the chance to advance during a moment of weakness. Russia sensed this window instantly. As soon as the pace of Ukrainian artillery slowed, Russian reconnaissance and electronic warfare teams reported unusual quietness across certain segments of the front. To Moscow, it was the sound of opportunity. They began funneling additional forces toward the Belgorod-Veluki corridor, an area behind Russian lines but close enough to support an offensive aimed at Kupiansk once the moment arrived. This buildup was not random. Russian doctrine traditionally emphasizes the use of terrain features and natural barriers to hide troop concentrations. Behind a large dam, inside a valley with steep sides, under heavy cloud cover. This was exactly the type of terrain Russian generals loved. The Veluki Valley, with its deep natural bowl and the enormous concrete form of the Veluki Dam looming overhead, seemed perfect. Viewed from above, the valley looked like a naturally fortified pocket. Russian officers believed it would shield troops from drones, reduce thermal signatures, and provide natural angles that made radar detection more difficult. On paper, it sounded like an ideal staging area. They used the valley exactly as their training manuals taught them to. They pulled more than 600 soldiers into the bowl. They parked armored vehicles in neat lines. They set up communication stations, artillery platforms, and even temporary barracks. They built field kitchens, repair zones, and fueling points. The plan was simple. Hide here, rest here, organize here, and then move toward Kupiansk for a decisive push once the Ukrainian lines cracked under ammunition shortages. But what looked perfect on paper masked a deadly flaw. While the steep slopes of the valley did conceal the regiment, they also transformed it into a single concentrated target. Every vehicle, every soldier, every ammunition crate, every command center was compressed into a relatively small area. From a military planning perspective, concentration can be powerful when preparing for an offensive, but it can also be catastrophic if the enemy finds the right angle of attack. The Russians believed this valley offered them safety. In reality, it offered Ukraine something far more dangerous. A single pressure point that, if struck correctly, could unleash destruction unlike anything seen in modern European warfare. At the heart of this weakness stood the Veluki Dam. Behind it sat 85 million cubic meters of stored water. To put that in perspective, that is enough water to flood entire towns, carve new paths through the landscape, and generate a tidal wave capable of carrying away armored vehicles. The Russians never imagined that Ukraine would target such a massive piece of infrastructure. They believed the political and humanitarian implications alone would prevent such a decision. They also believed that Ukraine lacked the tools to carry out a precise strike that could breach the dam without causing uncontrolled downstream devastation. That assumption would prove fatal. What happened next began almost by accident. Ukrainian reconnaissance units had been flying drones across the region to monitor Russian troop buildups. These were not large drones. They were small, light, and often operated by teams miles away, relying on thermal imaging to detect movement at night. One of these drones flew over the Valuyki region just before dawn. The operator watching the screen expected to see small groups of Russian soldiers, the usual supply trucks, or perhaps scattered armored vehicles. But the image that lit up the thermal display was something completely different. The valley glowed with heat signatures so densely packed that the drone operator initially thought there was an error. Dozens of vehicles stood in perfect rows, their engines generating deep red signatures on the thermal feed. The drone could clearly see the silhouettes of 18 BTR, 82 A armored carriers, 9 MTLBs grouped near the edge of the woods, 6 T-72B 3 tanks, and several Vozdika self-propelled artillery units. Even the air defense systems were visible. The Tunguska stood out sharply, with its radar dish emitting a distinctive thermal profile. Nearby, a Shilka traced a similar shape. Tents, fuel trucks, mobile command stations, ammunition piles. Every heat source in the valley combined to paint a picture that felt surreal. It looked less like a military formation and more like a training diagram brought to life. But the most important detail was not the vehicles. It was their location. The entire regiment was positioned directly beneath the Veluki Dam. When Ukrainian command received the footage, they immediately understood what they had discovered. This was the most concentrated gathering of Russian forces Ukraine had ever identified inside Russian territory during the entire war. and they were sitting in the worst possible place for themselves. The Ukrainian officers and engineers examining the footage quickly realized they were witnessing something extremely rare, a chance to use a natural structure as a weapon, not through random destruction, but through a carefully controlled strike that exploited a deadly flaw in Russian planning. But identifying the opportunity was one thing. Acting on it was something else entirely. Breaching a dam is not a decision taken lightly by any military. It is unpredictable. The consequences can stretch far beyond the battlefield. Civilian areas downstream risk flooding. Infrastructure can collapse. Water systems can fail. Even if the targeted area appears isolated, the ecological and humanitarian impact must be assessed carefully. Ukrainian engineers knew this. Ukrainian leadership knew this. The decision to strike such a massive structure required not just military confidence, but scientific precision. Yet the situation on the front was desperate. Ukraine needed a way to halt the Russian push toward Kupiansk. If they allowed Russia to reach their logistical arteries while ammunition was low, the consequences could spill across the entire Eastern Front. The Ukrainian commanders requested immediate assessments. Engineers analyzed the dam's internal structure, flood paths, and pressure zones. They conducted rapid simulations. They reviewed the terrain downstream and confirmed that previous evacuations earlier in the year had left certain areas unoccupied. They studied how the floodwater would travel, how quickly it would accelerate, and where it would hit with maximum force. The verdict came back. A controlled strike, executed with absolute precision, could unleash a torrent powerful enough to demolish the Russian regiment without causing civilian catastrophe. It was a once-in-a-generation strategic opening. Ukraine approved the plan. Once the decision was made, Ukraine moved with speed and secrecy. Success depended on perfect coordination between artillery crews, engineers, intelligence teams, and drone operators. A single mistake could ruin the entire operation or, worse, cause massive collateral damage. The first step involved positioning the launch systems that would deliver the strike. 3 HIMARS launch vehicles had been hiding for days under thick forest cover to avoid Russian detection. Their crews moved only at night, communicating through silent gestures instead of radios. This ensured Russian electronic warfare units could not intercept any signals that might reveal the plan. At the same time, 2 Ukrainian drone teams prepared special decoy aircraft. These are not ordinary drones. They were designed to mimic the radar signature and flight behavior of Neptune cruise missiles. Their purpose was straightforward: distract Russia's advanced air defense network just long enough for the real strike to reach the dam. As the sun disappeared and the region sank into darkness, the operation began. The decoy drones launched first, slowly climbing into the sky before accelerating toward the Veluki Dam. Russia's 96L6E radar, a powerful system integrated with modern air defense complexes, detected them almost immediately. The radar operators identified the incoming objects as potential cruise missiles. Russian air defense crews sprang into action. The Tunguska tracked the radar echoes. The Panzer S-1 swiveled its cannons and missile pods toward the northwest. Searchlights cut across the sky. Tracking computers calculated interception paths. All Russian attention shifted upward. This was exactly the window Ukraine needed. While the Russians prepared to shoot down the decoys, the HIMARS crews fired their real payload. 6 precision rockets programmed to fly at low altitude, hugging the landscape to remain nearly invisible to enemy radar. These rockets were designed for stealth. Their flight path kept them beneath the radar horizon, weaving between hills and valleys as they advanced toward the target. The decoys continued to draw Russian fire. Tunguska cannons erupted, spraying the sky with tracer rounds. Panzer S-1 missiles streaked upward, detonating as they attempted to intercept the decoy signatures. To Russian operators, everything looked normal. They believed they were successfully defending the dam. They had no idea that the real strike was racing toward them, nearly invisible. Within minutes, the HIMARS rockets reached the dam. Ukrainian engineers had spent days studying structural diagrams, geospatial data, and water pressure models. They identified the points where a strike could trigger failure without causing uncontrolled collapse. The rockets struck the dam in rapid succession. The first explosion ripped through the spillway control shaft, sending shudders through the entire structure. The second and third detonations compromised load-bearing walls. Internal corridors fractured. The concrete groaned under immense stress. Steel supports bent and tore apart. Then the dam failed. A low rumble grew into a deafening roar as 85 million cubic meters of stored water burst forward. Engineers refer to this as a hydraulic shock wave. Imagine a force that combines the impact of an explosion with the mass of a moving lake. The water did not simply flow. It detonated outward, accelerating with each passing second, picking up debris, concrete, and earth as it transformed into a moving wall of destruction. The steep sides of the Veluki Valley acted like a funnel, forcing the water to compress and accelerate. Within seconds, the wave reached speeds of nearly 70 kilometers per hour. The air in front of the water compressed into a blast wave powerful enough to knock over small structures before the water even touched them. The Russian regiment had no chance to react. The first people to sense danger were soldiers standing near the edge of the camp. They heard a faint rumble and turned toward the dam, only to see a dark shape racing toward them. It was not water they saw. It was the absence of light, the shadow cast by a wall of water taller than the trees. The flood hit the camp with astonishing force. The first row of tents disintegrated instantly. Armored vehicles, some weighing more than 40 tons, were picked up and thrown like debris. Tanks lost their anchors and tumbled sideways. BTRs collided with one another, folding under the pressure. The lighter MTLBs disappeared almost instantly, swept away by the swirling chaos. The noise was unlike anything recorded earlier in the war. It was the sound of steel twisting, engines breaking apart, and earth being carved open. The command post vanished in seconds. Radios went silent. Engines shut down. Soldiers caught in the open were overwhelmed before they could take a single step. Gasoline tanks ruptured. Ammunition crates burst open. The entire camp dissolved into a mixture of water, mud, and shattered machinery. A Ukrainian drone, still observing from a distance, captured the aftermath. What had moments earlier been a fully equipped regiment had transformed into a muddy wasteland scattered with broken metal. Vehicles lay twisted and submerged. Heat signatures from engines flickered briefly as they drowned beneath the torrent. Then everything went still. The valley that had once appeared so neatly organized became unrecognizable. Russia's most significant tactical buildup for the Kupiansk offensive had been erased. Not defeated, not scattered, but erased. Satellite images taken hours later confirmed the scale of destruction. The valley floor had shifted. Water pooled across areas that used to hold tents and vehicles. Debris lay in tangled piles. The regiment no longer existed in any functional form. Russia lost tanks, armored carriers, artillery platforms, air defense systems, communication hubs, and hundreds of soldiers in a matter of seconds. The impact on the Kupiansk front was immediate and severe. The offensive Russia had been preparing stalled instantly. The momentum they had been building for months evaporated. Ukrainian defenders, though stretched thin and struggling with ammunition shortages, now had breathing room. They held the line long enough for international support to resume. A gap that could have led to the collapse of the Eastern Front was narrowly avoided. Globally, the event sparked discussions about new vulnerabilities in modern warfare. Strategists realized that as wars become more technologically advanced, old infrastructure, dams, bridges, tunnels, reservoirs, remains just as relevant, if not more so. The Valuyki incident forced generals, policymakers, and engineers to rethink how military station forces near critical structures. It raised questions about the ethics and risks of weaponizing environmental features. It influenced how countries assess threat levels around civilian infrastructure during conflicts. Economically, the failed Russian offensive contributed to fluctuations in global markets. Energy prices rose due to renewed uncertainty. Agricultural markets reacted to concerns about grain routes. Insurance firms reassessed their risk models for war zone infrastructure. All of this happened because of an event triggered by a dam deep inside Russia, an event that, under different circumstances, might never have been possible. The destruction of the Veluki regiment became one of the most discussed and analyzed moments of the Russia-Ukraine war, not simply because of its tactical brilliance, but because it demonstrated how quickly the dynamics of a conflict can change. It highlighted how innovation, timing, and environmental awareness can combine to produce outcomes that influence both military campaigns and international politics. What happened in that valley showed that warfare is not just about firepower. It is about understanding terrain, exploiting mistakes, and adapting in real time. Ukraine, under immense pressure, used creativity and necessity to turn a dam into a strategic weapon. The result was a blow so devastating that it reshaped the direction of the Eastern Front during a moment when defeat seemed dangerously close. It also reminded the world that war does not exist in isolation. A single tactical decision can affect the global economy, alter diplomatic strategies, and redefine the future of international security. The flood that wiped out a regiment in Russia sent ripples across continents, influencing fuel prices in Europe, grain supplies in Africa, and financial markets in Asia. This is the interconnected world we live in, where local decisions have global consequences. The Veluki Valley incident will be studied for decades, not because of its shock value, but because it teaches a lesson every modern military must understand. In an era of advanced weapons and digital warfare, the natural world remains the most powerful force on the battlefield. Water, terrain, pressure, elevation. These elements can shift the tide of war when used with precision and understanding. Ukraine demonstrated that even when resources are limited, strategic thinking can turn the environment itself into an ally. If you found this deep dive insightful, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to Prime World Connect. Your support allows us to continue bringing you stories that reveal how global events shape the future we all share. What happened in the Veluki Valley wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a global lesson in how wars can pivot on a single decision. Ukraine's calculated strike reshaped the Kupiansk front, stalled a major Russian offensive, and reminded the world that terrain, timing, and intelligence can be more powerful than firepower alone. The flood didn't just erase a regiment. It sent shockwaves through markets, military doctrines, and geopolitical strategies across continents. If you want more calm, analytical storytelling that makes sense of a chaotic world, make sure you subscribe to Prime World Connect, your window into the reality behind global events.